Welcome to Crosstalk Solutions. My name's Chris, and today we have a really fun and easy Raspberry Pi project for you. We're going to be doing a complete setup of PiVPN using WireGuard as the VPN service. So this is not like a, NordVPN or VPN proxy type of VPN. This is a Raspberry Pi device that's going to sit on your local network at your home or office, and you will be able to connect into this device from the outside world to have access to your files and your internal services. You can also surf the web from your home IP, just like you're sitting in your home office or your home network. And this project, of course, would not be possible without the fine folks at PiVPN that have put together this project. They make it super simple, super easy. I'm going to be following along with a blog post that I wrote that has complete step-by-step instructions for everything that I'm going to do in this video. I'll put a link down to that blog post down below. Also in that blog post is a link to PiVPN.io, as well as a page that tells you how you can contribute to that project if you are interested and if you have found this incredibly useful like I have. Okay, before we jump right into PiVPN, if you guys enjoy this type of video, make sure you give a like and subscribe to Crosstalk Solutions for 2 to 3 brand new tech videos every single week. And if you found this tutorial useful, you can also buy me a beer. There's a link to do that down below in the description. All right, so prerequisites. What do we need to start off with this project? Number one, you're going to need a Raspberry Pi, of course. You can install PiVPN on other operating systems. There's some instructions about that in their GitHub page. I have not done that, all right? I've only installed it on a Raspberry Pi, so I don't have any experience installing it on CentOS or Ubuntu or whatever else you might be able to install it on. So unless you're doing it on Raspberry Pi, the instructions might be a little bit different for you. You're also going to need a micro SD card. I would recommend a 32 gig or so micro SD card. You could probably do it on a 16 gig card. Make sure it's class 10 though. Class 10 cards have the best performance with Raspberry Pis. You also optionally can use a keyboard and monitor to hook up to the Raspberry Pi for the initial configuration. You don't have to do that. But you can. It does make things a little bit easier for you, and it's only temporary. It'd basically just be during the boot up and sort of initial configuration of the Pi. Then you don't need that keyboard and monitor anymore. You're also going to need about 30 to 60 minutes worth of time. Now this is what I would consider a sort of mid-intermediate project. I'd give it like a 4 out of 10 on the difficulty scale. It's really easy to follow the instructions, but some of the concepts in terms of, port forwarding ports through a firewall, some of the networking and VPN concepts we're going to discuss, those may be a little bit advanced if you are completely new to this type of VPN project. Getting started, the first thing that we need to do is get Raspbian OS Lite onto our micro SD card. And to do that, the first thing you want to do is download the Raspberry Pi Imager. That can be found at raspberrypi.com/software. There's also a link to that in the blog post. So you can download it for Windows or Mac or Ubuntu. And essentially the Raspberry Pi Imager looks like this. So you can choose your operating system. In our case, we want Raspberry Pi OS Other. And then we're going to do Raspberry Pi OS Lite 32-bit version. Now, I also tried this on a 64-bit version, and it did not work perfectly. Okay, so I think the installer that's created by the PiVPN project is made for the 32-bit version, and with the 32-bit version, it works perfect. So just go with the 32-bit version. You could also potentially choose, the full-blown Raspbian OS with the GUI and everything if you wanted to. Just keep in mind that the GUI of the device is going to take away from some of the resources of the device. It takes CPU and RAM to run that GUI, and if you're limited on that, I have the Raspberry Pi 4 2 gig version. That's the one that I'm using here. It works fine with the as this VPN server with the Lite OS. It might be a little bit sluggish if you were using the full-blown Raspbian with the desktop GUI and everything like that, depending on how many VPN clients are going to connect to it, right? So if you just want the best possible VPN experience and you have a dedicated Pi for this purpose, then just go with the Lite OS. It's going to work perfectly fine. You can also choose your storage. So this is the micro SD card. Here we can see I have it mounted already. It's a 32 gig card. All right, so note here, this is going to erase your micro SD card. So if you've got pictures of your kids or pictures of your grandma or last year's tax returns on this micro SD card and you don't want to lose that stuff, make sure you know what you're doing, right? This is going to erase the card. So make sure it's a card that you are okay with erasing. Okay, so normally we would just hit right. But here we want to actually click the settings gear icon here to bring up some additional options. So we can set a host name if we want. This is kind of optional. I'm going to call this PiVPN.local. We do want to enable SSH. We're going to use password authentication. We're going to set a username and password of Pi, or the username of Pi, and then put in your own password here. Make sure it's a strong, unique password for this server. Now, we do not want to configure Wi-Fi. For the purposes of this VPN, we are not going to connect over Wi-Fi because it's not going to be as solid as a connection as actually plugging in to the Ethernet port on the Raspberry Pi. So we're going to wire this in, not use it wirelessly, so I'm not going to configure Wi-Fi. But I am going to set my location settings. Los Angeles, US for the keyboard is perfectly fine for me. We're going to click Save and Write. And yes. Okay, so I have my micro SD card all ready to go with Raspbian Lite installed. The next thing we need to do is install it into our Raspberry Pi. We're going to pop it in just like so. And then we're going to hook up all of our sort of accessories here. So we have network and then power. Now, those are the two main things that you want to hook up. You can also optionally hook up a keyboard and monitor, which I'm going to be doing here. But you can just SSH directly to the device and not hook up the keyboard and monitor if you don't have one available or if you just want to go straight to the device. Now, the advantage of hooking up a keyboard and monitor, let me go ahead and fire this up while I'm talking here. The advantage of hooking up a keyboard and monitor is that you can easily get the IP address that is given to this device upon first boot. Now, if you don't have a keyboard and monitor hooked up, you can still figure out the IP address of the device. You just have to do it by looking at, for instance, your DHCP lease table. Look at what addresses have been handed out recently to various devices. You should be able to find it that way. You can also sort of just wait for it to boot up completely, and you should be able to ping PiVPN.local on your local network. Okay, so here we go. We can see PiVPN login, and I'm going to log in as Pi, and then the password that I set during the initial setup in the Raspberry Pi imager, and I am now logged in, although it is still doing some boot up stuff. Okay, so I'm logged in. We can see the prompt down here. In order to get my IP address, I can just do IP space A, and I can see that the IP is 192.168.200.209. That's the IP address that was handed to this device from the DHCP server. Back at my desktop now, I have brought up an SSH window and connected to that IP address, 192.168.200.209, and I'm going to log in as Pi with my password. And there we go. I am now logged into my brand new PiVPN server, but it's not set up yet, right? So we need to actually install PiVPN. But before we install PiVPN, let's go ahead and update this server to make sure we have all of the latest and greatest packages. To do that, we're going to say sudo apt update and, which is short code for run this command and then run this command. So sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade -y. And now it's going to go through, download all of the necessary packages, update the device, and then we're going to be able to install PiVPN. Okay, updating the Pi took about a minute and a half, and we are now back at our prompt. Installing PiVPN is as easy as going to pivpn.io and then copying this command right here. So I've copied that. We're going to shift insert to paste it and press enter. Now, what this is going to do is download some packages, and then it is also going to fire off an installation wizard, and we will walk through the steps of that wizard. Okay, PiVPN Automated Installer. This installer will transform your Raspberry Pi into an open VPN or WireGuard server. Okay. PiVPN is a server, so it needs a static IP address to function properly. In the next section, you can choose to use your current network settings or manually edit them. So now we can see that the device was given the IP of 192.168.200.209. That's the IP address of the device that was handed to it by DHCP. So from here, you've got two options. We can actually change this IP address to an IP address that is outside of our DHCP lease range, right? So my range is like 192.168.200.100 through 254. So I can basically put it at something less than 100 so that I know no other devices in my network will ever be handed out that IP address. Or you can go into your DHCP settings and set a DHCP reservation for this IP address, 192.168.200.209. So for me, I'm going to set it statically because I'm going to set it to an address that's easier to remember for me than 200.209. So we're going to say yes to keep your DHCP, no to set up a static IP address. So we actually want to do no. Do you want to use your current network settings as a static address? We're going to say no. And then we want to backspace over this, and I'm going to make it 200.30/24, tab and OK. And then the gateway is the same, so I can just press enter. Are these settings correct? Yes, they are. Okay, now choose a local user that will hold your OpenVPN configurations. Well, it says OVPN configurations, but originally this project was just OpenVPN, and then they added in WireGuard support later on. So some of the things in the wizard like this still reference OpenVPN only, even though we're actually going to be using WireGuard. So we'll just say OK. We only have a single user on this server, so that makes our choice really easy. Tab and then OK. And here we can choose WireGuard or OpenVPN. Now it explains here that WireGuard is a new kind of VPN that provides near instantaneous connection speed, high performance, and modern cryptography. It's the recommended choice, especially if you are going to use mobile devices where WireGuard is easier on the battery than OpenVPN. So we want to use the latest and greatest technology. We're going to choose WireGuard and we're going to say OK. Now this is the port that WireGuard uses. By default, it's UDP 51820. You're going to want to remember that because we have to open a port through your firewall so that clients can connect to our server a little bit later in this tutorial. You can also change this value if you don't want to use the default WireGuard port. For our purposes though, we're just going to use 51820. Are these settings correct? Yes, they are. Okay, now what DNS provider do we want to use? Any of these are going to be perfectly fine. I'm personally going to choose Cloudflare because that's 1.1.1.1. It's the easiest for my little brain to remember. We're going to say OK. And now it's going to ask us, will your clients be connecting in using a public IP address or a DNS entry? So, a couple of things to consider here. If you have a static IP address, then this is fine. You can use IP, or you can create a DNS record like myhome.whatever.com that points to your static IP address and then use a DNS entry. If, however, your ISP gives you a dynamic IP address, an IP address that potentially changes from time to time, then you're probably going to want to use a DNS entry, and you're going to want to set up something like dynamic DNS. There's a number of services that will automatically update a domain name, a DNS name, anytime your IP address changes. That kind of stuff is beyond the scope of this tutorial. For me, I'm just going to use this public IP address since I have a static IP address already. Okay, server keys will now be generated. Since this server will have at least one port open to the internet, it's recommended that you enable unattended upgrades. This is basically just saying, hey, do you want to enable security updates to happen automatically? I'm going to say yes because, again, I don't want to have to think about updating my PiVPN anytime I think there's a security vulnerability or anytime there's some sort of new package that needs to be installed. We're just going to enable unattended upgrades. All right, installation complete. Now run PiVPN add to create the client profiles. We're going to do that in just a second. Let's go ahead and say OK. And then we're going to say, would you like to reboot now? Yes. System will now reboot. OK. Now, while this is rebooting, remember, if you changed to a static IP address different from the one that was given to the device by your DHCP server, when you reconnect, you're going to want to reconnect to the new IP address, not the old IP address. Okay, looks like it's back up, and I'm going to connect to the new IP address, 192.168.200.30, and we're going to log back in. Now I am logged in and we are good to go. So the next thing we need to do is add some VPN users. So for instance, I'm going to say PiVPN-A to add user, enter a name for the client. We're just going to call this client1. Enter. All right, client1 was successfully created. Let's create another one. Why not, right? PiVPN-A, enter name for the client, client2. Okay, so we've created two different clients that can connect into our VPN server. And I would recommend having a different client for every single device that is going to be connecting in. You don't want to reuse devices, because like if you have one on your phone and you have one on your laptop and you lose your phone, someone might be able to potentially get in. So you want to be able to like remove the phone user anytime you want without affecting your other devices that are still okay to connect. The next thing that you want to do before you can start connecting clients is set up a firewall rule, a port forwarding rule, that allows traffic from the outside world to come into your firewall on UDP port 51820 or whatever port you chose during the PiVPN setup wizard. So in my case, I have an edge router 4. The port forwarding is going to be different for everyone watching this video depending on what kind of firewall device you have, but every firewall device out there should have the ability to do port forwarding, right? So if you don't know how to do port forwarding with your own device, just Google, my router name port forwarding, and you'll probably find the answer that way. So for me, what we're doing here is we're saying my WAN interface is ETH0, my LAN interface is ETH1, and the port that we're forwarding is port 51820. The protocol is UDP, so not TCP, but UDP. And then we're forwarding it through to the IP address of my PiVPN, which is 192.168.200.30. I have forward to port blank because I'm not changing the port. It just means that it's going to use this port as the source and the destination. And then a description of PiVPN. And then you can apply that rule. So that's how I did port forwarding in my device. Your mileage may vary. So next we need to figure out how are we going to get our clients connected. And I'm going to do this two ways. I have my phone here, which I'm going to get connected, and then I'm going to also use the WireGuard client in Windows. So the first thing we need to do is download the WireGuard client for Android or iOS. And this is what it looks like when you first get to it. There's basically nothing here except a button that says add a tunnel. So going back to our client here, we can say PiVPN-QR. And that's going to generate a QR code for us. It's going to say, which client do you want to generate the QR code for? I'm going to say client number 1. And then that generates a QR code that we can just scan with our phone. So here's what WireGuard looks like when there's nothing installed so far. When I don't have any tunnels, we're going to say add a tunnel. And we're going to say create from QR code. Then it's going to want access to our photos, so grant that if you haven't done that, or access to the camera, go ahead and grant that, and then scan the QR code on the screen. Name the scanned tunnel, and then it asks for permission to create that VPN tunnel, which I said yes, that's fine. And now we have this PiVPN 3 on my phone, and all I have to do is turn it on. But I'm currently on that same network. So the first thing I'm going to do is disable my Wi-Fi, disconnect from Wi-Fi, and go on to LTE. All right, so Wi-Fi is off. You can see the little LTE icon in the top right-hand corner. I'm going to check the box to turn on this VPN tunnel. And that's it. I'm connected. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out now that I have the client installed. Using our ping, we can see that I can ping the IP address of the PiVPN server, 192.168.200.30, no problem. However, if I go back right now and I try to ping the gateway of my network, .1, nothing. I don't get any replies. Let's try to ping my NAS at .11. Also no replies, right? Let's also just try to ping an internet address, /.org. Again, we're not getting any responses. So I'm connected to VPN, but it's not routing any traffic. So let's see if we can fix that. Back at my desktop here, if I do PiVPN, there's a list of commands that we can run. And one of the commands is -d debug, start a debugging session if having trouble. So let's go ahead and do that, PiVPN -d, and it runs some checks. And it says, Oh, IP table's masquerade rule is not set. Do you want to fix it now? We'll say yes. Input rule is not set. Do you want to fix it now? Yes. Forward rule is not set. Do you want to fix it now? Yes. And then it kind of goes through with everything else. So let's go ahead and give ourselves a reboot now. So sudo reboot. And then we're going to check it again once we've finished rebooting. Back in our app for testing the network connectivity, let's try a ping to the device. We're getting a ping to 192.168.200.30. Let's try to ping my gateway again. Start. There we go. 192.168.200.1. The gateway is now pinging. And let's try my NAS. Start. And that's working as well. All right, so let's try to bring up a web interface to my NAS. And there we go. I can actually log into my Synology NAS through my phone's VPN remotely. Let's also try a remote website like /dot.org, and that is working as well. Great. So we have our phone client connected, but what about Windows, right? How do we get a Windows machine also connected to this device? So the first thing you want to do is download the WireGuard VPN client for Windows. And once you've downloaded and installed it, here we have import tunnel from file. From file, like what file are they talking about? Well, the files are generated on the device itself, so on our PiVPN Raspberry Pi server. In order to get those files off of the server, we need to connect into that server and remove them, right? Or just copy them off. So to do that, we can use something like WinSCP. So here we have WinSCP, and SCP is basically a way to log into a Linux device, but with like a Windows file browser, right? So we're going to say protocol is SCP, host name is 192.168.200.30, port is 22 because that's the SSH port, username is Pi, and then the password that you set up for your PiVPN server. Then click login and update, or it should say accept. I've already connected, that's why it said update. And now we have this configs folder. So if I double click configs, we have client 1 and client 2. So I'm going to go ahead and download client 2, and then we're going to go back to WireGuard. I'm going to say import tunnels from file. I've browsed to and selected my client 2 VPN file, and now all of the information is here in WireGuard. I'm currently connected to that same network, so I'm actually going to disconnect from that network, and we're going to go to a different network that I have set up here in the house. Okay, so I'm connected to a different network, and we can see that my external IP address ends in .30. Now, let's connect with the WireGuard VPN. We're going to say activate, and now we're connected. If I go back to whatismyip.com and refresh the page, my IP address has now changed and it ends in .26 instead. So we know that we're connected. If I browse to my Synology NAS, we can see that I can also log into my local Synology NAS from a remote connection. Logging back into our PiVPN, how do we know which clients are connected? Well, we can do that with PiVPN-C, and that's going to tell us our clients list, or our connected clients list, and it tells us the last time that we saw that client. Final thing that we want to do with our PiVPN server is take a backup. And of course, anytime you make significant changes to any sort of server like this, you're going to want to run a backup and download it so that if it crashes, you can just restore it onto a new one. To run a backup in PiVPN, we're going to say PiVPN-BK, enter, and it tells us that it's created our backup in home, PiVPN backup, and then, time, date, stamp, etc. So bringing WinSCP back, if we go to home Pi, we can now see there's a new folder called PiVPN Backup. We can double click on that. There's our backup. You just want to download it for safekeeping and put it somewhere where you're not going to lose it. That's going to do it for PiVPN. What do you guys think about this project? It's pretty fun, pretty easy to do, and really simple to have a Raspberry Pi just sitting there waiting for VPN connections so that you can connect in remotely when you go to a hotel or you're at a conference or on the road or at work or whatever. It's just great to have this kind of access to your home network, and also the ability from like a hotel to surf through your home network so that you're not having to use that hotel's sort of public WAN IP to get out to the internet. You can use your own. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you give me a thumbs up and subscribe to Crosstalk Solutions for 2 to 3 brand new tech videos every single week. If you're interested in just buying me a beer because I've helped you set up your own PiVPN server, there's a link down below to do that as well. All right, we'll see you guys in the next video.